General Thakmor of the Zelkarian Empire stood before the massive holographic display in his command center, his 4 eyes narrowing as he studied the latest intelligence reports. The blue-scaled alien's tail twitched with irritation as he reviewed the data streaming in from the front lines of what should have been a simple conquest. The humans had been a recent discovery, found on a small blue planet in an unremarkable system. Initial scans showed them to be a primitive species that had barely achieved interstellar flight. Their weapons were crude, their ships laughably outdated, and their military doctrine seemed non-existent. The Zelkarian war machine had steamrolled over dozens of similar civilizations in the past century. This should have been no different. Yet here he stood 3 months into what was supposed to be a 2-week campaign, staring at casualty reports that made no sense. His forces had superior numbers, better technology, and centuries of military experience. The humans had nothing but determination and an apparently complete disregard for conventional warfare. Commander Vextal approached cautiously, his claws clicking on the metal floor. The younger officer had been one of Thakmor's most promising subordinates before this campaign began. Now his scales had dulled with stress and his movements carried the uncertainty of someone whose worldview had been shattered. "General, we have another incident report from the 7th Fleet," Vextal said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thakmor's primary eyes swiveled toward his subordinate while his secondary eyes remained fixed on the tactical display. "What happened this time?" "Admiral Kor's flagship was destroyed, sir." "The humans. They used one of our own tactics against us, but wrong. Completely wrong according to every military manual ever written." The general's tail stopped twitching. Admiral Kor had been a veteran of 30 campaigns, a master tactician who had never lost a single engagement. His flagship, the dreadnought Retribution, was one of the most advanced vessels in the Zelkarian fleet. "Explain," Thakmor commanded. Vextal activated a smaller holographic projector, showing a 3-dimensional replay of the battle. The humans appeared to be retreating in disorder. "Our standard protocol in such situations is to maintain formation and apply pressure gradually." Admiral Kor followed doctrine perfectly. The hologram showed the Zelkarian fleet advancing in perfect formation, their ships maintaining optimal spacing and firing solutions. The human vessels appeared scattered, some even colliding with each other in their apparent panic to escape. "But then," Vextal continued, his voice growing strained, "the humans did something impossible. They intentionally rammed 3 of their largest vessels into our formation. Not guided missiles, not automated drones. Crude ships with thousands of humans aboard." Thakmor watched in fascination as the replay showed the human ships suddenly changing course, their engines overloading as they accelerated directly toward the Zelkarian fleet. The first ship struck the formation's left flank, its explosion creating a massive gap in their defensive screen. The second ship followed immediately, targeting the center of the formation where Admiral Kor's flagship was positioned. The third ship, Vextal's voice cracked slightly, somehow managed to ram 2 of our heavy cruisers simultaneously. The explosion was so massive it disabled 6 additional vessels. "Suicide attacks are not unknown in warfare," Thakmor said slowly, though his mind was racing. "Desperate species sometimes resort to such tactics when facing extinction." "That's what we thought too, sir. But this was the 7th such attack in 2 weeks. And the humans are not facing extinction. Our intelligence suggests they're not even using their primary military forces." Thakmor's 4 eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "The ships involved in these attacks were cargo vessels, passenger transports, even scientific research ships. We've identified miners, merchants, and civilian engineers among the casualties. They're converting civilian craft into weapons and finding volunteers to crew them." The general's claws extended involuntarily. In Zelkarian culture, as in most civilized species, military and civilian populations were strictly separated. The idea of merchants and miners deliberately piloting ships into combat was almost incomprehensible. "There's more, sir," Vextal continued reluctantly. "Our xenobiology experts have been studying human psychology, trying to understand their behavior. They've made some disturbing discoveries, such as humans appear to have an unusual relationship with death and sacrifice. They have concepts like heroism and martyrdom that don't translate well into our language. They actually celebrate individuals who die for causes they believe in." Thakmor processed this information slowly. The Zelkarian Empire had encountered fierce resistance before, but it had always followed predictable patterns. Species fought hardest when defending their homeworlds, became more desperate as their military capabilities were degraded, and eventually surrendered when the cost became too high. They're not following any recognized pattern of behavior, he mused aloud. No, sir. If anything, they seem to be getting more aggressive as the conflict continues. Our latest intelligence suggests they're actually celebrating these suicide attacks as victories. The general moved to the tactical display and zoomed in on the human home system. Earth hung there like a blue-green jewel, seemingly peaceful and defenseless. Yet from this small world, humanity was somehow projecting a level of military unpredictability that had stalled the most efficient war machine in the galaxy. Show me the latest battlefield recordings, Thuckmore ordered. A series of hollow projections filled the air around them. In one, a damaged human frigate, its hull cracked and bleeding atmosphere, continued firing even as it fell apart. In another, human soldiers wearing primitive armor charged directly at Zelkarian heavy tanks, carrying weapons that could barely penetrate their armor. But it was the audio recordings that truly disturbed him. Instead of the screams of fear or desperation he expected, the human voices carried something else entirely. They were shouting encouragement to each other, singing something they called battle songs, and even laughing as they fought. General, Vextal said quietly, there's something else. Command wants to know when you expect to complete the conquest of human space. Thuckmore stared at the tactical display for a long moment. Every conventional military calculation said the humans should have surrendered weeks ago. Their losses were catastrophic, their technology inferior, their numbers laughably small compared to the Zelkarian Empire. Yet somehow they were not only still fighting but actually gaining momentum. Send a message to High Command, he finally said. Tell them we need to completely reassess our approach to this species. I'm beginning to suspect that we may have made a fundamental error in our initial evaluation. As Vextal hurried away to send the message, General Thuckmore remained standing before the display, his 4 eyes fixed on the small blue world that was somehow defying every law of warfare he had ever learned. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the abandoned mining station, her rifle clutched tightly in her hands. Around her, the remnants of her company took cover behind whatever debris they could find. They had been fighting for 6 straight hours, and ammunition was running dangerously low. The Zelkarian assault force had cornered them in the station's central hub after a running battle through the mining tunnels. According to every tactical manual Sarah had ever read, this was the end. They were outnumbered 4-1, cut off from reinforcements, and facing enemies with superior technology and firepower. But Sarah Chen had thrown away her tactical manuals 3 weeks ago. Johnson, she called to her communications specialist. Are you still in contact with the mining crews on level 7 and 8? Private Johnson nodded, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. Yes, ma'am, but they're just civilians. Miners and engineers, not soldiers. Perfect, Sarah grinned, and several of her soldiers exchanged knowing looks. They had learned to recognize that particular expression on their captain's face. It usually meant she was about to do something that would either save their lives or get them all killed in spectacular fashion. Tell them to start the emergency protocols for Tunnel 7, Sarah ordered. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams interrupted. Tunnel 7 leads directly to the main fusion reactor. If they flood it with coolant, the pressure change could destabilize the entire station. I know exactly what it could do, Sergeant. Williams stared at her for a moment, then slowly nodded. Like the rest of the company, he had learned that Captain Chen's plans usually worked even when they seemed insane. Outside their defensive position, the Zelkarian forces were regrouping. Through the transparent aluminum windows, Sarah could see their blue-scaled forms moving with military precision. Their commander, a tall alien wearing elaborate armor, was coordinating the final assault with the methodical patience of a species that had conquered half the galaxy. The Zelkarians had studied human military doctrine, such as it was, and adapted their tactics accordingly. They expected the humans to either surrender when the situation became hopeless, or make a final desperate stand that could be easily crushed with superior firepower. What they didn't expect was for the humans to turn the battlefield itself into a weapon. Coolant flooding initiated, Johnson reported. The miners are asking if they should evacuate the lower levels. Tell them to stay at their posts, Sarah replied, and ask them to begin the shutdown sequence for the artificial gravity generators. This time, even her most loyal soldiers looked concerned. Sergeant Williams cleared his throat. Captain, with respect, shutting down the gravity generators while the coolant is flooding will create a zero-gravity environment filled with superheated liquid. Anyone caught in those tunnels will die. The Zelkarians don't know that, Sarah said simply. She moved to the window and studied the alien formation. The Zelkarians were advancing carefully, using their energy shields to protect against human weapons. Their movements were textbook perfect, exactly what any military academy would teach for assaulting a fixed position. They're thinking like soldiers, she murmured to herself. But we're not soldiers. We're humans. The distinction was important. The Zelkarian military machine was built on discipline, hierarchy, and predictable tactics refined over centuries of conquest. Every officer was trained to think several moves ahead, to minimize casualties, and to achieve objectives with maximum efficiency. Humans, Sarah had discovered, excelled at throwing efficiency out the window when survival was at stake. "Ma'am," Johnson called out, "I'm getting reports from the other companies across the sector. They're all requesting permission to implement Chen Protocol." Sarah raised an eyebrow. She hadn't realized her improvised tactics had been given a name, much less spread to other units. "What exactly is Chen Protocol?" "Use whatever's available, ignore safety regulations, and make the enemy think we're all completely insane," Williams replied with a straight face. Despite the desperate situation, Sarah laughed. "That's actually pretty accurate." The Zelkarian assault began with a coordinated barrage of energy weapons, the air filled with the crackling sound of plasma bolts striking their defensive barriers. Sarah's soldiers returned fire with their primitive kinetic weapons, the sharp reports of gunfire echoing through the station. But Sarah wasn't watching the firefight. She was watching the Zelkarian commander, studying his reactions as the first part of her plan went into effect. The alien officer paused as his sensors detected the unusual energy readings from the lower levels. His head tilted in a way that suggested confusion as the station's gravity began to fluctuate. Sarah could almost see him trying to understand what kind of tactical advantage the humans thought they could gain from destabilizing their own position. "Now," Sarah whispered into her communicator. Throughout the station, the human defenders began phase 2 of what Command was apparently calling Chen Protocol. Instead of holding their positions and trading fire with the advancing Zelkarians, they did something that violated every principle of defensive warfare. They charged, not in formation, not with any coordinated plan, but as individuals in small groups, each moving in seemingly random directions. Some headed toward the Zelkarian positions, others toward the compromised lower levels, and a few even ran toward areas of the station that served no apparent tactical purpose. The Zelkarian commander's careful formation wavered as his troops tried to respond to attacks, coming from directions that made no sense. His tactical displays showed human soldiers moving through areas that should have been lethal due to radiation leaks, charging into corridors filled with superheated coolant, and setting up ambush positions in locations that offered no strategic advantage. Sarah sprinted down a corridor that led to the mining equipment storage, followed by half her squad. Behind her, she could hear the confused voices of Zelkarian soldiers trying to coordinate their response to an attack pattern that followed no recognizable military doctrine. "Captain," Williams panted as they ran. "Where exactly are we going?" "To get the industrial mining charges," Sarah replied. "The big ones they use for breaking up asteroids. Those aren't weapons, ma'am. They're designed for controlled demolition." "I know what they're designed for, Sergeant. But I also know what they'll do to an enemy formation if we use them creatively." Behind them, explosions echoed through the station as other human squads began implementing their own interpretations of Chen Protocol. A group of miners had apparently decided to vent the station's atmospheric processors directly into the main corridor, creating a cloud of toxic vapor that their basic environmental suits could handle but which sent the Zelkarians scrambling for cover. Another team had somehow managed to reprogram the cargo-handling robots to attack anything that registered as non-human, turning the station's own maintenance systems into improvised weapons. The Zelkarian commander's voice could be heard over their communication channels, frantically trying to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anything in his military experience. His forces were still superior in every measurable way, but they were fighting an enemy that refused to follow the rules that made their superiority meaningful. Sarah reached the storage area and began attaching detonators to the mining charges while her squad provided cover. Through the station's communication system, she could hear reports from across the sector. Human forces everywhere were implementing variations of the same basic strategy, turning every engagement into something their enemies couldn't predict or counter. "Detonators armed," she reported. "Everyone get ready to move. When these go off, we're going to have about 30 seconds of complete chaos." "What do we do in those 30 seconds?" Johnson asked. Sarah's grin returned, wider than before. "Whatever we want, Private. That's the beauty of Chen Protocol. As long as it confuses the enemy and keeps us alive, anything goes." As the mining charges exploded and the station shook around them, Sarah Chen led her soldiers into the chaos they had created, confident that their enemies' superior training and discipline would work against them in an environment where the only rule was survival. Ambassador Krishan of the Galactic Council had called emergency sessions before, but never one quite like this. The massive chamber aboard the neutral station Concordia buzzed with concerned voices from dozens of species, all discussing the reports filtering in from what had initially been dismissed as a minor border skirmish. The Zelkarian representative, General Thakmor himself, stood at the center podium looking like a commander who had aged several years in the past few months. His typically immaculate uniform was wrinkled, and his four eyes carried the haunted look of someone whose fundamental understanding of warfare had been shattered. "Honorable delegates," Ambassador Krishan began, her crystalline voice echoing through the chamber's translation matrix. "We have gathered to discuss the ongoing conflict between the Zelkarian Empire and the species known as humans. General Thakmor has requested this session to address concerns about potential violations of established galactic warfare conventions." A ripple of confusion passed through the assembled delegates. The galactic warfare conventions had been established over millennia and were based on the shared military experiences of hundreds of civilized species. Violations were rare and usually involved the use of prohibited weapons or attacks on civilian populations. General Thakmor activated the central holographic display, showing a tactical overview of the conflict zone. Red markers indicated Zelkarian positions, blue showed human forces, and gray areas represented contested space. What should have been a neat advancement of red markers into blue territory instead looked like a chaotic mess of overlapping colors. "Delegates," Thakmor began, his voice carrying the strain of recent events. "I stand before you today not to report victory over a minor species, but to formally request guidance on how to conduct warfare against an enemy that appears to recognize no established conventions of civilized combat." The chamber fell silent. The idea that a species could simply ignore galactic warfare conventions was almost unthinkable. These rules had evolved naturally from the military practices of every spacefaring civilization encountered in the past 1,000 years. "Please elaborate." "General," Ambassador Krishan prompted. Thakmor gestured to the display and it zoomed in on a recent battlefield. 3 days ago, my forces engaged a human fleet near the Kepler 442 system. The humans were outnumbered 3-1 and outgunned significantly. According to every tactical analysis, they should have either retreated to a more defensible position or attempted to negotiate surrender terms. The display showed the initial engagement, with Zelkarian forces advancing in perfect formation, while the human ships appeared scattered and disorganized. Instead, Thakmor continued, they did something unprecedented. They began broadcasting what they called music across all communication channels. Several delegates exchanged glances. Music during combat was not inherently problematic, though it was unusual. "The issue," Thakmor said, his voice growing strained, "is what this music apparently does to human psychology. Our xenobiologists have studied the recordings, and they believe it triggers some kind of combat enhancement in humans. They become more aggressive, less concerned with personal safety, and significantly less predictable in their tactics." The holographic display showed human ships suddenly breaking formation and attacking in patterns that made no tactical sense. Some vessels charged directly at superior forces, others began ramming maneuvers, and a few even started spinning in tight circles while firing in all directions. "They were singing," Thakmor added quietly. "Our recordings captured human voices singing along with this music while they died." Ambassador Krishan's crystalline features shifted into what other species recognized as concern. General, while unusual, the use of psychological enhancement techniques is not explicitly forbidden under galactic conventions. That's not the end of it, Takamura replied. He changed the display to show a planetary assault. This is footage from our attempt to secure the mining colony at Proxima Centauri b. Initial scans showed approximately 50,000 human colonists, most of them civilians with no military training. The display showed Zelkarian dropships approaching the colony's primary settlement. The buildings were simple prefabricated structures, clearly not designed for defense. According to conventional doctrine, we should have faced minimal resistance, perhaps a few security personnel with basic weapons, but nothing that would require more than a standard occupation force. What the display actually showed was something that defied every assumption about civilian behavior. As the Zelkarian forces landed, the human colonists didn't flee or surrender. Instead, they began systematically destroying their own infrastructure. They're implementing what our intelligence analysts have termed scorched earth tactics, Thakmore explained. They destroyed their own power plants, contaminated their water supplies, and even collapsed the mine tunnels that represented their primary economic asset. The footage showed human civilians, including elderly individuals and parents with children, working together to render their entire colony worthless to the occupying force. But that's economically irrational, protested the Centauran delegate, her voice high with disbelief. They're destroying the very resources that give their world value. Exactly, Thakmore agreed. From any rational perspective, their behavior makes no sense. A civilized species negotiates terms that allow them to maintain some level of prosperity under occupation. These humans seem to prefer mutual destruction to any form of surrender. He changed the display again, showing orbital surveillance of the colony 6 months after the occupation began, where there should have been a functioning settlement providing resources to the Zelkarian Empire. There was nothing but abandoned ruins and depleted mine shafts. We tried to rebuild their infrastructure using our own technology. Thakmore continued. The humans responded by forming what they call resistance cells that conducted sabotage operations against our construction efforts. They're not trying to reclaim their territory or negotiate better terms. They're simply trying to make occupation as costly and difficult as possible. The chamber erupted in confused discussion. The concept of a species that would rather destroy everything than accept defeat was alien to most of the assembled delegates. Furthermore, Thakmore raised his voice to regain attention. They've begun broadcasting these tactics to other human colonies throughout the sector. What we initially assumed was an isolated incident appears to be systematic behavior across their entire species. Ambassador Krishan studied the displays thoughtfully. General, are you suggesting that humans are inherently incapable of civilized warfare? I'm suggesting that they don't share our definitions of victory and defeat, Thakmore replied. When faced with superior force, every known species eventually calculates that surrender offers better long-term survival prospects than continued resistance. Humans appear to make the opposite calculation. He activated a final series of recordings, showing human military communications intercepted during recent battles. The translation scrolled across the display, but even through the universal translator, their meaning was clear. These are actual communications between human military units, Thakmore explained. Note that they're not discussing surrender terms or negotiating for better treatment. They're sharing techniques for maximizing damage to our forces, comparing casualty ratios and celebrating what they call tactical victories even when their strategic position is hopeless. One particularly disturbing intercept showed a human commander congratulating her troops for taking 3 of theirs for every one of ours while her ship was literally falling apart around her. They measure success by the cost they inflict on us, not by territory gained or resources preserved. Thakmore continued. This makes traditional military objectives meaningless. We can't negotiate with them because they don't want anything we can offer. We can't intimidate them because they seem to view death as an acceptable outcome. The chamber had fallen silent again as the implications of his words sank in. If humans truly couldn't be defeated through conventional means, it raised fundamental questions about the nature of galactic civilization. General, Ambassador Krishan said slowly, what exactly are you requesting from this council? Thakmore's 4 eyes met her gaze directly. I need to know whether the galactic community considers this human behavior to be a legitimate form of warfare or a violation of civilized conduct. Because if it's legitimate, then every military doctrine we've developed over the past millennium may be obsolete. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of implications none of the delegates wanted to contemplate. Commander Elena Vasquez floated in the zero gravity of her crippled ship's bridge, watching through the cracked viewport as the massive Zelkarian dreadnought approached. The UES Defiant had been running on emergency power for the past 6 hours, its weapons offline and life support failing. By every measure that mattered, the battle was over. But Elena had learned something important. About humans during the past year of warfare, they had a tendency to redefine what mattered. Status. Report, she called to her remaining crew members, who were scattered across the debris-filled bridge. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 7, reported Chief Engineer Santos, his voice muffled by his emergency mask. Main engines are gone, weapons are offline, and we've got maybe 30 minutes of life support left. Communications? Still functional, though I'm not sure why that matters, Lieutenant Park replied from his damaged console. Elena smiled grimly. It matters because we're about to give our friends out there a demonstration of why you should never corner a human. Through the viewport, she could see the Zelkarian dreadnought's launch bays opening. Boarding pods began deploying, their sleek forms moving with mechanical precision toward the Defiant's airlocks. The aliens were following standard protocol for capturing an enemy vessel, probably planning to take prisoners for interrogation and salvage whatever human technology might prove useful. Chief Santos, Elena called. Do we still have access to the engineering computers? Yes, ma'am, but there's not much left to control. I don't need much. Just access to the fusion reactor's safety protocols. The bridge fell silent as her crew realized what she was suggesting. Chief Santos cleared his throat carefully. Captain, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I should point out that disabling reactor safety protocols while we're this close to an enemy vessel would be considered a war crime under galactic conventions. Only if we were fighting a civilized war, Chief. But according to our recent intelligence briefings, the Galactic Council is having some difficulty determining exactly what kind of war we're fighting. She was referring to the reports that had been circulating among human military units for the past few weeks. Apparently, the Zelkarian Empire had gone to the Galactic Council complaining that humans weren't following proper warfare conventions. The idea that there was a proper way to be conquered had struck most human commanders as darkly amusing. Ma'am, Park interrupted, I'm getting a communication from the Zelkarian commander. They're demanding our surrender and offering standard prisoner of war treatment under galactic conventions. Elena laughed, a sound that carried no humor. Put me through to them. The main display flickered to life, showing the blue-scaled face of a Zelkarian officer. His 4 eyes studied Elena with what appeared to be professional courtesy mixed with curiosity. I'm Admiral Korthvin of the Imperial Dreadnought Overwhelming. Force, the alien said through the translation matrix. You have fought with honor, Commander, but your situation is hopeless. Surrender your vessel and your crew will be treated according to established galactic protocols. Elena studied the Admiral's face, noting the confidence in his expression. He truly believed that offering proper treatment under galactic law would be sufficient to secure her surrender. It was almost endearing in its naivety. Admiral, she replied, I appreciate the offer, but I'm afraid I have a counter-proposal. The Zelkarian's eyes narrowed slightly. You are in no position to negotiate terms, Commander. Actually, I think I am. You see, you're operating under the assumption that I want to survive this encounter. That's a reasonable assumption when dealing with most species. But humans have this peculiar trait where we sometimes value other things more than our own survival, Admiral. Korthvin's expression showed the kind of confusion Elena had come to expect from aliens trying to understand human psychology. What could be more valuable than survival? Making sure you understand that conquering humanity is going to cost you more than you're willing to pay, Elena replied simply. She turned to Chief Santos. Chief, disable reactor safety protocols and set the containment field to collapse in 5 minutes. Aye, Captain, Santos replied, his hands moving across his console with practiced efficiency. On the display, Admiral Korthvin's eyes widened as his sensors detected the changes in the human ship's power signature. Commander, what are you doing? I'm showing you the problem with cornering humans, Elena explained calmly. When most species face certain defeat, They surrender to preserve their lives and hope for better circumstances in the future. Humans tend to take a different approach. The boarding pods were almost at the Defiance airlocks now. But Elena could see new activity on the Zelkarian dreadnought as damage control teams scrambled to respond to what their sensors were telling them. "You're going to destroy your own ship?" Admiral Korthoven's voice carried genuine disbelief. "That's suicide." "No, Admiral, that's tactical nuclear detonation in close proximity to your ship. Suicide is just a side effect." Elena turned to her crew, all of whom were watching her with expressions of grim determination. Not one of them had protested her decision, and she realized that somewhere during the past year of impossible battles, humans had stopped thinking like individuals trying to survive and started thinking like parts of something larger. "The thing you need to understand," she continued, addressing the Admiral while her crew made final preparations, "is that we're not fighting to win this battle or even this war. We're fighting to make sure that every time you encounter humans, you remember what it costs." "This is insane," Korthoven protested. "Your death accomplishes nothing." Elena shook her head. "My death and the deaths of my crew accomplish exactly what we need them to accomplish. They ensure that the next time you face human forces, you'll hesitate. You'll second-guess your tactical decisions. You'll wonder if the humans you're fighting are desperate enough to take you with them." She could see the truth of her words registering in the Admiral's alien features. The Zelkarian Empire had built its military doctrine on predictable responses to overwhelming force. They calculated the cost of conquest based on standard resistance patterns that every civilized species followed. "And that hesitation," Elena continued, "will get you killed by the humans who are fighting to live instead of fighting to die." "Commander," Park called out, "I'm detecting massive energy spikes from Admiral Korthoven's ship." "They're trying to get clear of the blast radius," Elena nodded. "Too little, too late, Admiral. Your boarding pods are still attached to our hull, and at this range, your shields won't be enough." Through the viewport, she could see the Zelkarian dreadnought's engines flaring as it attempted to retreat. But the laws of physics worked against ships that massive. They couldn't accelerate fast enough to escape the blast radius in the time remaining. "Admiral," Elena said, her voice taking on the tone she might use to explain something to a child, "this is why you can't win a war against humans. We don't fight your war. We fight our war, and our war has different rules." 2 minutes to reactor breach, Santos reported. Admiral Korthoven's image flickered as his ship's communications array was damaged by weapons fire from another human vessel that had apparently emerged from behind a nearby asteroid. Elena smiled as she recognized the energy signature of the UES Relentless, commanded by Captain Martinez. "And that," she said to the Admiral, "is another thing about humans. We don't fight fair, we don't fight alone, and we don't fight to survive. We fight to make sure you regret starting this war in the first place." The display went dark as the communication link was severed, leaving Elena and her crew alone on their dying ship. Through the viewport, she could see the Relentless engaging the Zelkarian dreadnought, its smaller size allowing it to dart between the enemy's weapons while targeting critical systems. 1 minute to reactor breach, Santos announced. Elena closed her eyes and thought about Earth, about the blue skies and green forests she would never see again. Then she thought about the look of fear and confusion in Admiral Korthoven's eyes, and she smiled. "Make sure the data recorders survive the blast," she ordered. "I want command to have a complete record of this engagement." "Already done, Captain," Park replied. Elena opened her eyes and watched as the Relentless scored a direct hit on the Zelkarian dreadnought's main weapons array. Captain Martinez was implementing classic human tactics, using speed and unpredictability to engage a superior force. 30 seconds, Santos called out. "It's been an honor serving with you all," Elena said to her crew. "The honor was ours." "Captain," Chief Santos replied, speaking for all of them. As the reactor reached critical mass and the Defiant prepared to become a star for a few brief moments, Elena Vasquez smiled at the knowledge that somewhere in Zelkarian space, military planners were trying to figure out how to fight an enemy that valued victory more than survival. High Admiral Zekthor stood in the Imperial War Room, surrounded by holographic displays showing the current state of what was supposed to have been a minor conquest campaign. The blue-skinned Zelkarian leader was the supreme commander of the Empire's military forces, a position he had held for over 3 decades. He had overseen the successful integration of 47 star systems into the Empire, each conquest following predictable patterns that allowed for efficient resource allocation and minimal casualties. The human conflict was different. Completely inexplicably different, report, he commanded, his four eyes scanning the tactical displays that showed a chaotic mess of red and blue markers scattered across dozens of star systems. General Takmor approached the central console, his movements showing the exhaustion of a commander who had been fighting an impossible war for 8 months. Hi, Admiral. Our forces have achieved tactical victories in 63% of engagements with human forces. Zekthor's tail twitched with irritation. That should represent significant progress toward total victory. Show me our strategic gains. The holographic display zoomed out to show the larger conflict zone. Instead of the neat advancement of Zelkarian control that should have resulted from 63% tactical victories, the map showed something that defied military logic. Human resistance had actually increased in intensity, and several star systems that had been marked as conquered were now contested again. I don't understand this display, Zekthor said slowly. How are we winning battles but losing the war? That, General Thakmor replied grimly, is the question that's been keeping our strategic analysts awake for months. The humans don't appear to measure victory and defeat the same way we do. He activated a detailed analysis window that showed casualty ratios, resource expenditure, and territorial control over time. In conventional warfare, tactical victories translate to strategic gains because the defeated force becomes progressively weaker. Lose enough battles and eventual surrender becomes inevitable. That's basic military doctrine, Zekthor agreed. The humans are following different doctrine. They're treating each tactical defeat as a learning opportunity. Our intelligence suggests they're actively studying our methods, adapting their strategies, and sharing information across their entire species faster than we can counter it. The display showed a series of battle recordings, each one depicting human forces using increasingly sophisticated counters to Zelkarian tactics. What had started as crude, desperate attacks had evolved into something approaching professional military operations. More disturbing, Takmor continued, is their resource management philosophy. When we destroy human military assets, they don't attempt to preserve what remains. Instead, they use the wreckage as raw materials for new weapons. A recording showed human engineers salvaging components from destroyed ships to create improvised weapons platforms. What should have been irreplaceable losses were being turned into assets within days of being destroyed. They're also recruiting, Takmor added, activating another display. Every engagement with human forces results in more humans volunteering for military service. Their casualty rates should be reducing their available manpower, but the opposite is happening. Zekthor studied the recruitment data with growing disbelief. How many humans are we fighting? That's difficult to determine, High Admiral. Our initial intelligence suggested a population of approximately 8 billion on their homeworld, with perhaps 50 million scattered across their colonies. We estimated total military potential at maybe 500 million individuals. And current estimates? Based on engagement data, we appear to be fighting approximately 2 billion humans across all theaters of operation. The silence in the war room was heavy with implication. Zekthor's four eyes focused on his subordinate with laser intensity. Explain how their military has quadrupled in size during an active war. They're converting their entire civilization to military production, Takmor replied. Factories that produce civilian goods are now manufacturing weapons. Cargo ships are being retrofitted as warships. Civilian pilots are flying combat missions. That's economically unsustainable, Zekthor protested. No civilization can maintain total war production indefinitely. The humans appear to disagree, sir. Our economic analysts estimate their current production rate should have collapsed their civilian infrastructure months ago. Instead, their output is increasing. Another display activated showing intelligence reports from human space. Instead of the economic breakdown that should have resulted from total militarization, human colonies were somehow maintaining basic services while simultaneously increasing war production. They're operating their entire civilization as a military unit, Thakmor explained. Civilians are working in military production during the day and training for combat at night. Children are being educated in technical skills that support the war effort. Even their elderly population is contributing to weapons research. Zekthor stared at the data, trying to process information that challenged everything he understood about sustainable warfare. What about their morale? Surely the constant pressure is causing population unrest. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this conflict, Thakmor replied. Our psychological warfare specialists have been monitoring human communications, expecting to find signs of war weariness or desire for peace negotiations. And they're celebrating, High Admiral. They're actually celebrating. Human media broadcasts refer to successful defensive actions as parties and tactical victories as festivals. They've somehow convinced themselves that fighting us is entertainment. The display showed intercepted human media broadcasts, with humans discussing battle statistics the way other species might discuss sporting events. Casualty ratios were treated as scores. Successful missions were celebrated with music and dancing, and fallen soldiers were honored in ceremonies that resembled celebrations more than funerals. They've turned warfare into a cultural event, Thakmor continued. Human children play games based on battles against our forces. Their artists create music and visual art inspired by the conflict. They've integrated this war into their very identity as a species. Zekthor moved closer to the displays, studying footage of human celebrations following a battle where they had lost 70% of their forces. The survivors weren't mourning their losses. They were cheering their successes and planning their next engagement. High Admiral, one of his strategic advisors interrupted. We have an urgent communication from the Galactic Council. The main display switched to show Ambassador Krishan, her crystalline features reflecting what appeared to be concern. High Admiral Zekthor, the Council has completed its analysis of the human conflict. We need to discuss the implications immediately. What implications? Zekthor demanded. The Council's military experts have concluded that human warfare methods, while unconventional, do not violate galactic warfare conventions. However, they've raised concerns about the precedent this conflict might set for other species. The Admiral's claws extended involuntarily. What kind of precedent? 3 minor species have already contacted the Council requesting information about human-style warfare tactics. 2 others have indicated they're considering implementing similar strategies in their own territorial disputes. The war room fell silent as the full scope of the problem became clear. The human conflict wasn't just about conquering one unusual species. It was about the potential transformation of galactic warfare itself. Furthermore, Ambassador Krishan continued, the Council has received formal complaints from 17 member species whose trade routes pass through the conflict zone. Human forces have been recruiting civilian vessels from neutral species. Recruiting them for what? Zekthor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Combat operations, High Admiral. Human commanders have apparently convinced cargo ship captains from 6 different species to carry weapons and conduct raids against Zelkarian supply lines. They're paying them in salvage technology and offering what they call adventure tourism. Zekthor closed his 4 eyes and tried to process the implications. Not only were humans turning their own civilization into a military machine, they were somehow convincing other species to join them voluntarily. The Council's recommendation, Ambassador Krishan concluded, is that you find a way to end this conflict quickly, before human warfare methods spread to other species and destabilize the entire galactic military balance. As the communication ended, Zekthor stared at the tactical displays showing the expanding chaos of the human conflict. For the first time in his military career, he was beginning to understand what it meant to face an enemy that couldn't be defeated by conventional means. General Thakmor, he said finally, I want you to prepare a complete analysis of our strategic options. Include scenarios for negotiated settlement, continued engagement, and, he paused, the words difficult to speak, strategic withdrawal. For the first time in Zelkarian history, the Empire was considering the possibility that some conquests might not be worth the cost. Admiral Rebecca Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Terra's Wrath, watching as the largest Zelkarian fleet ever assembled moved into position around Earth's solar system. The massive armada contained over 3,000 warships, including 12 dreadnoughts and the Empire's newest superweapon, a planet killer called the World's End. After 18 months of warfare, the Zelkarians had apparently decided to end the conflict by destroying humanity's homeworld. It was a logical strategy from their perspective, one that should have terrified any reasonable military commander. Rebecca Morrison was many things, but reasonable had never been one of them. Fleet status report, she requested from her command staff. All human vessels are in position, reported her tactical officer, Commander Singh. We have 800 ships of various classes, plus approximately 2,000 civilian vessels that have volunteered for combat operations. Rebecca nodded. The volunteer civilian fleet was perhaps the strangest development of the war. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, scientific research vessels, and even luxury yachts had been retrofitted with weapons and were now part of humanity's defensive force. Their captains ranged from retired military officers to cargo pilots who had never fired a shot in anger, all united by the peculiarly human belief that anyone could be a warrior if the cause was important enough. What about our special preparations? Commander Singh grinned, an expression that had become common among human military personnel when discussing their more creative tactical innovations. All asteroid mining platforms have been converted to kinetic bombardment systems. The Luna shipyards have completed production of the graduation gifts for our Zelkarian friends. And the volunteer militia on Mars confirms they're ready to implement the Scorched Earth Protocol if necessary. Rebecca felt a surge of pride in her species. When faced with an enemy that wanted to destroy their homeworld, humans hadn't despaired or begged for mercy. Instead, they had spent months preparing the most elaborate and destructive welcome party in galactic history. Incoming. Transmission from the Zelkarian flagship. Her communications officer announced. The main display activated, showing the imposing figure of High Admiral Zekthor. The alien commander's 4 eyes showed the strain of 18 months of impossible warfare, and his once perfect uniform now bore the signs of a leader who had spent too many sleepless nights trying to solve an unsolvable problem. Admiral Morrison, Zekthor began, his voice carrying a weariness that transcended species barriers. I am authorized to offer humanity final terms for surrender. Lay down your arms and your species will be granted autonomous status within the Zelkarian Empire. Your culture and basic freedoms will be preserved. Rebecca studied the alien commander's face, noting the genuine hope in his expression. After 18 months of fighting humans, he had finally learned to fear what they might do when cornered. That's a generous offer, Admiral, Rebecca replied. More generous than your initial demands for unconditional surrender. I take it the war hasn't gone quite as you expected. Zekthor's tail twitched in what Rebecca had learned to recognize as Zelkarian frustration. Your species has proven to be more challenging than anticipated, but this fleet represents the full military might of the Zelkarian Empire. You cannot hope to defeat it. You're absolutely right, Rebecca agreed cheerfully. We can't defeat your fleet in conventional battle. Your ships are superior to ours in every measurable way, and you outnumber us significantly. The admission seemed to confuse the Zelkarian admiral, who had clearly expected defiant bravado or desperate bargaining. Then you accept our terms? Zekthor asked hopefully. Oh no, Rebecca replied, her smile widening. We're going to fight you anyway. You see, Admiral, you've made the same mistake your people have been making throughout this war. You keep assuming we're trying to win. What else would you be trying to do? Rebecca activated her own tactical display, showing the disposition of human forces throughout the solar system. We're trying to teach you a lesson about the cost of threatening humanity. Win or lose, this battle is going to be so expensive for your empire that you'll never consider attacking another human world. She could see the truth of her words registering in Zekthor's alien features. The past 18 months had cost the Zelkarian Empire more resources than their previous 10 conquest campaigns combined, and they still hadn't achieved their objectives. Admiral, Rebecca continued, let me explain what's going to happen when you attack Earth. First, our conventional fleet will engage your forces using every dirty trick, unconventional tactic, and outright violation of civilized warfare we've developed over the past year and a half. The tactical display showed human formations that violated every principle of naval combat Rebecca had learned in the academy. Ships were positioned to maximize damage to enemy forces rather than preserve their own survival, and several formations were clearly designed to create spectacular explosions rather than achieve tactical victories. Second, Rebecca continued, our civilian volunteers will implement what we call the swarm protocol. Every ship, from cargo haulers to pleasure craft, will attempt to ram your largest vessels. They won't all succeed, but enough will get through to cause significant damage. Zekthor's eyes widened as he processed the implications. You're planning to use civilian vessels as guided missiles? I prefer to think of them as very large, very enthusiastic bullets, Rebecca replied. But the real surprise comes when you try to land forces on Earth itself. She changed the display to show Earth's major population centers, each one surrounded by defensive positions that seem designed more for spectacle than military effectiveness. Every human city has spent the past 6 months preparing for your arrival, Rebecca explained. They've turned our entire homeworld into what our military planners call a spiky welcome mat. Landing on Earth won't just be difficult, Admiral. It will be so costly that you'll question whether any planet is worth conquering. You're willing to destroy your own homeworld rather than surrender? Rebecca shook her head. We're not planning to destroy Earth, Admiral. We're planning to make Earth destroy your invasion force. There's a difference. She activated a series of recordings showing human civilians practicing with improvised weapons, learning explosive techniques, and training in urban warfare tactics. Children who should have been in school were instead learning to operate anti-aircraft systems. Elderly humans who should have been enjoying retirement were teaching younger generations how to make explosives from household chemicals. You see, Admiral, you made one critical error in your assessment of humanity. You assumed we were fighting to preserve our civilization. In reality, we're fighting to transform it. Every battle against your forces has made us stronger, more unified, and more dangerous. The display showed industrial production figures that should have been impossible. Despite being under constant attack for 18 months, human manufacturing output had increased by 300%. How? Zekthor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because you gave us something we'd never had before, Rebecca replied. A common enemy that every human could unite against. You've turned our entire species into a military organization, and we're grateful for the lesson. She activated one final display, showing human colonies throughout the galaxy. Instead of the isolated, vulnerable settlements the Zelkarians had initially encountered, the display showed a network of militarized worlds connected by heavily armed merchant fleets. Win or lose today, Admiral, humanity is no longer the species you first encountered. We're something new, something that your empire helped create. And when this war ends, we're going to take everything we've learned and share it with every species in the galaxy that's ever been threatened by a superior force. The implications of her words hung in the space between their ships like a tangible threat. The Zelkarian Empire had created something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that grew stronger through warfare. This is madness, Zekthor said finally. No, Admiral, Rebecca replied, her smile carrying the weight of 18 months of impossible victories. This is humanity. And if you're really committed to this course of action, you're about to learn why every species in the galaxy is going to be very, very careful about threatening humans in the future. As the communication ended and the Zelkarian fleet began its final approach, Admiral Rebecca Morrison turned to her crew with the expression of a woman who was about to teach the galaxy's most powerful empire the most expensive lesson in military history. All ships, she broadcast across the human fleet, remember what we're fighting for. Not victory, not survival, but the future of every species that refuses to bow to superior force. Show them what humans do when someone threatens our home. The response that came back from nearly 3,000 human vessels was not a military acknowledgement, but something far more dangerous. It was the Subeka. Morrison smiled at the knowledge that win or lose, the galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had transformed warfare itself, and that transformation was about to spread to every species capable of fighting for their freedom. The age of easy conquest was over, and the age of human